Peter Rabbit was a mischievous little rabbit, always full of energy and curiosity. He had a knack for finding trouble wherever he went, and his adventures were the talk of the animal community. With a nose for adventure, Peter was always on the lookout for something new and exciting. He loved exploring the forest, hopping through the underbrush, and discovering hidden nooks and crannies. He lived under a fir tree with his mother and sisters, Flopsy, Mopsy, and Cottontail. Their home was cozy and warm, nestled in the roots of the great tree. The family shared many happy moments together, playing and laughing in their little burrow. They were a happy family, but Peter often got into trouble. His mischievous nature led him into all sorts of predicaments, much to the exasperation of his mother and the amusement of his sisters. One sunny morning, Mrs. Rabbit was getting ready to go to the market. The sun was shining brightly, and the air was filled with the sweet scent of blooming flowers. It was the perfect day for an adventure, or so Peter thought. "Now, children," she said, "be good while I'm gone." Her voice was gentle but firm, a tone that the little rabbits knew well. They nodded obediently, though Peter's mind was already wandering to thoughts of adventure. "And Peter, whatever you do, don't go near Mr. McGregor's garden." Peter's ears drooped at the mention of the garden. He knew he should listen to his mother, but the lure of the garden was almost too much to resist. He loved adventures, and Mr. McGregor's garden with its rows of delicious vegetables was the biggest temptation of all. The garden was a forbidden paradise, filled with juicy carrots, crisp lettuce, and plump tomatoes. Peter could almost taste the fresh vegetables as he imagined sneaking into the garden. Peter's curiosity got the better of him. As soon as his mother was out of sight, he made his way to the garden. He squeezed through a gap in the fence, his heart pounding with excitement and a little bit of fear. Once inside, Peter couldn't resist the temptation. He nibbled on a carrot, then a radish, and soon he was munching on everything in sight. The garden was a feast, and Peter was in heaven. But his joy was short-lived. Mr. McGregor spotted him and came running, shouting and waving a rake. Peter's heart raced as he darted through the rows of vegetables, trying to find a way out. With a burst of speed, Peter managed to escape through the same gap in the fence. He ran all the way home, his little heart pounding in his chest. He had narrowly escaped, but he knew he was in big trouble. When he got home, his mother was waiting for him. She scolded him gently but firmly, reminding him of the dangers of disobeying her. Peter hung his head, feeling guilty and ashamed. Despite his misadventure, Peter was grateful to be home with his family. They comforted him and reminded him that they loved him no matter what. Peter promised to be more careful in the future, though he knew his adventurous spirit would always lead him to new and exciting places. "Why can't we go to Mr. McGregor's garden, Mother?" Peter asked, his nose twitching with curiosity. The garden was always so green and full of delicious vegetables. It seemed like a paradise to him. "Because Mr. McGregor is a grumpy old man," Mrs. Rabbit explained, "and he doesn't like rabbits in his garden." She patted Peter's head gently, her eyes filled with concern. "He has set traps and might catch you if you go there," she added, her voice trembling slightly. "It's not safe, Peter. Now promise me you won't go," she insisted, her voice firm but loving. Peter looked up at his mother, seeing the worry etched on her face. He nodded slowly, trying to reassure her. Peter mumbled a promise, but in his heart, he knew he couldn't resist the lure of the forbidden garden. The thought of the crisp lettuce, the juicy carrots, and the sweet peas was too tempting. He glanced towards the garden, his mind already plotting. As soon as his mother was out of sight, he hopped to his feet. His heart raced with excitement and a bit of fear. He knew he was disobeying his mother, but the call of adventure was too strong to ignore. "Adventure awaits," he whispered to himself, a determined glint in his eye. He took a deep breath, steeling himself for what lay ahead. The garden was just a hop away, and he was ready to face whatever challenges it held. Peter carefully made his way through the bushes, his small body moving stealthily. He peeked through the fence, his eyes widening at the sight of the lush garden. It was even more beautiful up close, and the vegetables looked more delicious than he had imagined. He squeezed through a small gap in the fence, his heart pounding in his chest. He was finally inside Mr. McGregor's garden. Peter looked around cautiously, making sure the coast was clear. The garden was quiet, and there was no sign of Mr. McGregor. Peter wasted no time. He hopped over to the nearest lettuce patch and began nibbling on the crisp leaves. The taste was heavenly, and he couldn't help but smile. He moved from one vegetable to another, enjoying the feast laid out before him. Suddenly, Peter heard a noise. His ears perked up and he froze. Was it Mr. McGregor? He looked around nervously, his heart racing. He quickly hid behind a large cabbage, trying to stay out of sight. Peeking out from his hiding spot, Peter saw Mr. McGregor walking towards the garden. The old man looked grumpy, just as his mother had said. Peter's heart pounded in his chest as he tried to think of a way to escape. With careful, quiet movements, Peter began to sneak away. He found a small hole in the fence and squeezed through it, his heart still racing. He had made it out of the garden, but he knew he had to be more careful next time. Peter returned home, feeling a mix of relief and excitement. His mother welcomed him back, unaware of his adventure. Peter knew he had been lucky this time, but he couldn't help but wonder what other adventures awaited him in the future. Peter scurried towards Mr. McGregor's garden. He squeezed under the gate and gasped. Rows of juicy carrots, plump cabbages, and crunchy lettuce stretched before him. It was a feast fit for a king. He nibbled on a carrot, savoring its sweetness. Then he tasted a radish, then a lettuce leaf. "Mr. McGregor is missing out," Peter mumbled between bites. Suddenly, a shadow fell over Peter. He looked up and froze. It was Mr. McGregor. The grumpy old man was shaking his fist and yelling, "Get out of my garden, you pesky rabbit!" Peter panicked. He scampered through the garden, Mr. McGregor hot on his tail. He dodged sprinklers, hopped over watering cans, and squeezed under fences, his heart pounding in his chest. Peter finally saw an escape route, a small hole in the hedge. He squeezed through, but in his haste, he left one of his little blue shoes behind. He was too scared to go back for it. Panting and exhausted, Peter raced towards home, his mind filled with the scary image of Mr. McGregor. He never wanted to see a carrot ever again. Peter burst into the burrow, his heart still racing. He flung himself into his mother's arms, tears welling up in his eyes. Mrs. Rabbit held him close, comforting him with gentle strokes. "Oh, Peter," she sighed. "I knew you wouldn't listen." She gave him a warm hug. "It's all right, you're safe now." Peter snuggled close to his mother, feeling safe and loved. The warmth of her fur and the gentle rhythm of her heartbeat made him feel secure. He remembered the stories she used to tell him about the dangers of the outside world, especially Mr. McGregor's garden. Those tales were meant to keep him safe, but Peter's curiosity had always been stronger than his caution. He realized how foolish he had been to disobey her. The memory of the chase through the garden, the fear that gripped his heart, and the close calls with Mr. McGregor's tools were still fresh in his mind. He felt a pang of regret and wished he had listened to his mother's warnings. Her wisdom, born from experience, was something he had taken for granted. Mr. McGregor's garden wasn't worth the fear and the danger. The lush, tempting vegetables had seemed so inviting, but the price of that temptation was too high. Peter remembered the narrow escape, the adrenaline pumping through his veins, and the relief when he finally made it back to the safety of his burrow. The garden, once a place of allure, now seemed like a trap. From that day on, Peter never went near Mr. McGregor's garden again. He would often look at it from a distance, a reminder of the lesson he had learned. The sight of the garden, with its neatly arranged rows of vegetables, no longer tempted him. Instead, it served as a symbol of the consequences of disobedience and the value of his mother's guidance. He learned that listening to his mother was always the best adventure of all. Her stories, filled with wisdom and love, became his guide. He realized that true adventure didn't always mean taking risks. Sometimes it meant making wise choices and valuing the safety and love of family. His mother's voice, gentle yet firm, became the melody of his daily life. But Peter's adventures weren't over yet. The world was still full of wonders and mysteries waiting to be explored. He found joy in the simple things, like the rustling of leaves, the chirping of birds, and the beauty of the forest. Each day brought new discoveries, and Peter learned to appreciate the magic in the ordinary. One day, something magical happened that changed everything. As Peter ventured deeper into the forest, he stumbled upon a hidden glade bathed in golden light. The air was filled with the scent of wild flowers, and the sound of a gentle stream echoed in the distance. In the center of the glade, a mysterious, glowing object caught his eye. It was unlike anything he had ever seen, and he felt a sense of wonder and excitement. This new discovery promised a new chapter in his life, filled with magic and endless possibilities. One afternoon, a peddler came to the forest selling wares. He offered Mrs. Rabbit a handful of strange-looking beans. "Magic beans, ma'am," he said with a wink. "Plant them, and you'll see wonders." Mrs. Rabbit, skeptical but curious, took the beans. She knew Peter loved anything magical. "Let's plant them, Peter," she said with a smile. Peter and his mother planted the beans in their garden. The next morning, they awoke to a sight that made their eyes pop. A giant beanstalk had sprouted, reaching high into the clouds. Peter, ever the adventurer, was eager to climb it. "Please, Mother, can we climb it? Please," he begged, his eyes shining with excitement. Mrs. Rabbit, though hesitant, agreed. They climbed the beanstalk, which seemed to stretch endlessly into the sky. Finally, they reached a land high above the clouds. There, they met a friendly giant who loved rabbits. The giant showed them his amazing home, filled with giant vegetables and talking animals. Peter and his mother had never seen anything like it. After an amazing day, it was time to go home. The giant helped them climb back down the beanstalk. Peter hugged the giant goodbye, promising to visit again soon. Back in their own garden, Peter realized something important. Adventures weren't just about disobeying rules. They were about discovering new things and making new friends. And sometimes, the most magical adventures were right in your own backyard.